13 of this year's Presidential Symposium, which is dedicated to AI in higher ed. My name is Amir Gandomi. I'm an associate professor with the Department of Information Systems and Business Analytics at Zarb. And I'm delighted to moderate a distinguished panel of experts from industry and from our own dean in this session. By the show of hands, just to get a sense of the audience, how many of you are familiar with the difference between supervised learning and unsupervised learning? By the show of hand. High up, please. Thank you. All right, how about reinforcement learning? By the show of hand. All right. Okay, so my goal is to first do a quick introduction to these concepts to make sure that we all have a common understanding of concept of AI and machine learning. I'm going to be very quick because I don't want to waste our time and would love to spend the time having a wonderful conversation with our panel. It's only 3 slides, so bear with me. And then once we are done with the introduction, we will have a panel discussion. We will be focusing on applications of AI in industry, the future directions, and most importantly, how our students should prepare themselves for this rapidly evolving landscape. My goal is to have an engaging and dynamic conversation, and I need your help with that. So please make sure to prepare your questions. I'll give you a 10-minute notice before we end the discussion and end of the panel to get the questions from the audience. In terms of definition of AI, I took this from Oxford reference. I'm just going to read it. Is the theory and development of computer systems able to perform tasks normally requiring human intelligence. This can be done in many different ways, one of which is rule-based systems. In 2017, shortly after I joined Hofstra and moved to New York, a close family member of mine was diagnosed with cancer and went to 3 doctors back home and got 3 different recommendations. At the time, we were debating what to do. I came across someone with access to IBM Watson for Oncology, which is a platform that takes patient information, all relevant information for treatment planning, and it will give the recommendation based on current, most up-to-date guidelines, in that case, NCCN guidelines, and also best practices. It was a partnership between IBM and MSK, Memorial Sloan Kettering. That product was discontinued. That's besides the point. I brought up this example as an example of rule-based AI systems. We have some guidelines, we have some rules, we get the machine to tell us what to do based on those guidelines. In 1980s, a new paradigm emerged, which is machine learning. The takeaway from this is that machine learning is a subset of AI, and perhaps arguably the most important or the most commonly used approach to building AI systems these days. For machine learning, I'm using an example from a research I was involved a couple of years ago. This was about finding evidence of bilateral infiltrates in chest radiology reports. Bilateral infiltrates are abnormal substances in lung tissues that occur in both sides of the lung. And our goal was to come up with a way of processing this natural language and get the evidence, classify a report as positive or negative. I started with the rule-based approach, which is the conventional or traditional paradigm in computer science. Let's write a program, give the program explicit rules on what needs to be done. For example, if the word bilateral or biapical is followed by, after some distance, with the word infiltrates, then it's a positive, unless there's a negation in the senses, rules of that nature. And this attempt failed because there's just many different ways that a radiologist would write a report and report the positive occurrence of bilateral infiltrates. No matter how much I would fine-tune the reports, in millions of documents, we would find a lot of errors. The second approach, which is machine learning, the paradigm that I mentioned, we reverse the order. What we do is that we give the machine, the algorithm, some examples. You see some examples I've put on the top bottom right corner of this slide. These are some labels. We call this so-called training data set. We got some trained radiologists to read each one of these sentences and let us know whether it's a yes or no, whether it's a positive or negative when it comes to bilateral infiltrates. And we will feed that to the machine, and using some statistical mathematical methods, the algorithms will train to give us the desirable output based on the relationship. So map the input to the output and use that to label new instances. And that's what machine learning is all about. Now, this can happen in three different ways, or there are three types of machine learning. The example that I just went over is an example of so-called supervised learning. We have a training data set with labels, and the goal is to find the relationship between input and output, get the machine learn that function and give us the answer. When I was preparing this presentation on Overlift, which is a platform for an editor, online editor, LaTeX, I came across that reCAPTCHA that you see top right corner of this slide. I'm sure everyone has seen this. The goal is for the website to detect whether we are dealing with a bot or a real user. But there is a side use case for this, and Google is getting us to give them free labels for different supervised learning products that they have. The example that you see, detecting buses in pictures, is actually going to be used and is being used in training their driverless car. So this is another example of supervised learning. A second type of machine learning is unsupervised learning. In the interest of time, I won't cover that title of the paper. I'll give an easier example. The idea here is to use the training data set, which does not have any labels. There's no need to produce the labels. Use the data set to find relationships, patterns, structures that are relevant to the study. An example would be market segmentations. Imagine that we have Amazon Prime customers data set, bunch of different data points, features on each customer. We have their age, gender, name, their transactions, everything. And we want to find customers who are similar to each other, put them in so-called different clusters so that we would have customers who behave similarly and different from other clusters. And that way we can have more targeted marketing strategies. Instead of trying to address the entire population, we will come up with tailored strategies for each cluster. That's unsupervised learning. A more recent fascinating example or type of machine learning is reinforcement learning. This is actually the building block of some of the generative AIs, including ChatGPT, that has gained so much attention and has been so effective these days. Reinforcement learning belongs to prescriptive analytics. The idea is not to predict something. The idea is to prescribe the optimal action, especially in cases where we do not have ground truth. We do not have labels. We don't know what's right and what is wrong. In the case of acute respiratory distress syndrome, the patients who are placed on ventilators, we do not, there are some guidelines, general guidelines for patients, but what a doctor should do on day 2 for a specific patient, given how they have responded, how should they set up this machine, how much oxygen, how much pressure. We don't have guidelines. No one knows what's the best optimal approach to treating that single patient. And that's what reinforcement learning is capable of finding. It will find optimal actions, even if we have suboptimal data in our training set. I have put a QR code. There's a award-winning documentary on AlphaGo, which is a DeepMind product, now a Google company. They were among the first pioneers of reinforcement learning. They came up with an algorithm that beat the champion of Go game, which is perhaps the most complete board game in the world. They use reinforcement learning, and this documentary has a fascinating story around that. You can scan the QR code and watch it. It's DeepMind AlphaGo. You can look it up on YouTube. I'm sure you're going to enjoy it. With this quick introduction, please allow me to welcome and introduce our panelists to the stage. We are going to be focusing on applications of AI right now in different industries. What are the future directions, and again, as I mentioned, how students should prepare themselves down the road given the latest advances in this field. We are honored and grateful to have Alaina Sammartano, who is a partner in technology and transformation at Ernst & Young, our Hofstra and Zarb alum. We are so grateful to have them. Please help me to welcome them on the stage. Dr. Janet Lenaghan, who is the Dean and Professor of Management and Entrepreneurship at Frank G. Zarb School of Business. Dr. Jason Naidich, who is Senior Vice President and Chief Innovation Officer at Northwell Health. And Dr. Michael Hill, Distinguished Research Staff Member in IBM Research AI Department. Thank you all. Okay, thank you for taking the time in your very busy schedule to come and talk to us and share your valuable insight to perhaps set the stage and in line with the theme of this symposium. In your opinion, is AI a friend or foe? What do you think are the opportunities and challenges that we have? Janet? Or...
I'm actually going to start with our panelists.
Sure.
Our guests.
Sure.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. It's a real honor and privilege to be here today. I'll try and speak about the industry that I work in, which is healthcare. And when I was thinking about friend or foe, I would say friend, but sort of a new friend that you're not quite sure about yet. You know, the kind of friend that's a lot of fun, but you know could get you into trouble. So starting with where I think the benefits lie within healthcare, I go back to the triple aim, which was stated by Don Berwick, who was then the head of the IHI, the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, which was pretty obvious, but needed to be stated because we haven't been so successful in this space, which is one, primary aim of healthcare is to improve the health of patients in the populations that we serve. The second is to improve patient experience. The third is to reduce healthcare costs. And that triple aim was upgraded to a quadruple aim in 2014 to include improve the well-being of our caregivers, because there's been an epidemic of burnout in healthcare. So I think that AI has the potential, and we're already seeing the benefits along all four of those domains. And later on, we'll talk about specific examples of how at Northwell we're using AI to improve healthcare across all four domains. But the reason why I said what I said in the beginning about the potential for harm is that it's new technology, and it's been released to the public before people have had the opportunity to put safeguards in place. So when I think about specific examples of how people can get themselves into trouble, number one, an example is there's Epic, which is our big electronic health record has been working with OpenAI to incorporate ChatGPT to be able to answer patients' emails or faxes. Well, no one faxes anymore, but emails or texts directly to free up the time of the physician, which is a great thing. But you can imagine a situation where if 95% of the texts are accurate or 99% of the responses that are automatically generated are accurate, at some point humans are going to stop reading and just automatically send the responses. And you can imagine, even if 1% of the time it's wrong, an automated message that tells a patient to do something that's incorrect could lead to a lot of damage. That's just one example. A second example I'll just give is, I've read with great interest, there was a legal case where, and I use this example, even though it's outside healthcare, I use this to scare our folks a little bit into using caution, where a junior attorney prepared a brief, submitted the brief, and didn't review the research. And as we know, or as most of you probably know, generative AI can, quote unquote, hallucinate. So when it doesn't know the answer, it can make up an answer that seems very plausible. So it quoted case law that doesn't exist. And the judge who reviewed the brief saw that the case law didn't exist. Not only did the junior attorney get into trouble, but the senior partner, who is ultimately responsible for the work, may get disbarred. So those are just a couple of examples. And then you talk about intellectual property and protecting intellectual property. And you're just beginning to hear a lot about what people are talking about, well, what about these large language models that were developed based on data that other people spent years of their lives creating? How do you protect intellectual property in this world? And do companies have the right to use protected data to train their large language models? How do you know what's real, right? As a consumer of this, how do you know, unless we watermark everything that's created with AI, how does anybody know what truth is going forward? So I'm going to spend most of the time talking about the benefits, but I do want it to couch the discussion in the fact that there are very real risks that I don't think any of us are prepared to deal with right now. And I think we need to spend a lot of time in a multidisciplinary fashion figuring out how we protect ourselves and mitigate that risk.
That's great. Alaina, if you want to.
Yep, sure. Hi, everyone. So from an Ernst & Young perspective, we have one of my favorite slogans is, building a better working world. So AI is really going to give us the opportunity to ask better questions and solve bigger problems. But how we get ahead of everything we've been talking about already is, as excited we are about the possibilities, how do we really embed trust in AI? How do we develop a framework and a governance structure that allows us to maintain that trusted advisor status, as well as that innovative transformation partner? So we are doing a lot of work, and we'll talk a little later about how we've invested already in AI, but we're really focused on what is that government strategy, what are AI ethics and standards, what do we do from an information security perspective? We own a lot of client data within our walls, and what is that data governance model as we do start to build out AI solutions, that we're training models in a way that they are delivering the appropriate results, because all of us will be in a lot of trouble if those answers are wrong and no one can really dial back from the initial problem to what we've presented. So we are definitely on the double front of excited about the possibility, but really focused on that governance and strategy as well.
So the question, I think one of the questions was AI friend or foe, and let me turn it around as a question to the audience. But I'll change one of the words. And rather than AI, I'll ask car, friend or foe. So how many vote friend? Okay. How many vote foe? Got at least one? Okay. So I think, the idea of that exercise is that clearly cars have been pretty good for most people, but definitely bring a danger to society. And if you go back and look at films from the 1920s when the cars were driving around Manhattan, it's a pretty scary sight. There's no lanes, there's no traffic lights, they're just going all over the place. That was a pretty scary situation. So when you think about AI, there's similar parallels there. So like with AI, there's some things that you're using now, like on your phone. How many people like the fact, you don't have to answer this, but how many people like the fact that when you start typing a text, it suggests words, or when you're typing an email, it suggests auto completion. or you're Googling, searching for things, or you're on Netflix and it recommends something else by the same director. Or you're asking it, could you help me complete this essay or this sentence or summarize this paper, right? These are all things that sound like they're pretty positive things. But then, as was already mentioned, there's many, many risks here. And two examples, one was already mentioned, I'll just add on it, the lawyer. So our lawyer friend actually believed that there had a concern that maybe this wasn't accurate. And they actually asked ChatGPT, I told you, give me 5 court cases that were precedents for whatever the brief was going to be about. And the lawyer said, okay, let me, ChatGPT, tell me, are these real? Because there was a concern that maybe they're not real. Maybe it was hallucinating. And ChatGPT said, yes, they were all real. And then the story, as Jason said, got filed. Right? Second example is a professor, I think it was in Texas, had a class of like 10 students, and it was mostly a non-writing class, but at the end of the year, they had to do a final writing exercise. And the professor looked at it and said, I'm not so sure. I think this could have been generated by ChatGPT. So cut and paste the text of each essay into ChatGPT and said, did you write this? And ChatGPT said yes in all 8 cases, and wound up failing all the students who didn't graduate. And it turned out the students did not use ChatGPT. Right? So what's going on here? A risk that's not talked about a lot is just an understanding of what the technology is capable of doing and what it's not. So as if we thought it was a human asking it, did you write this? Well, clearly it has a memory and knows if it did that. And it turns out that's not the way it works, right? So there's a whole bunch of risks like hallucination, like bias, like the lack of explainability. And then there's this other risk, which is expectations, that what we think it's maybe human-like because it's pretty impressive, but in fact, it doesn't work the way we think it works. And therefore we may misuse the technology, just like you can misuse a car, for example.
I would just add, I think friend or foe really depends on how we use it, right? And so one of the things we focus on at Zarb is making sure that all of you as students recognize that you are a key part, right, of this process. That human loop that Ethan Malik talks about out of Wharton is so critically important. So what we want to make sure that all of you as students are recognizing is that it can have tremendous benefits, as were pointed out, but you also have to be involved in that process and critically think and interact with it in a way that you're constantly reinforcing, right? And questioning whether or not the information that you're getting is accurate and whether or not that information can actually lead to desired results. And that's really critical. And when we think about it from a human resource management perspective, HR functions in most organizations were one of the first early adopters of AI. And so we heard from the keynote presenter around how it's used heavily in selection, but truthfully, it's used throughout the employee's life cycle, right? So it's not just sourcing and selection, but it's also performance evaluation, professional development, lots of really great and helpful ways that HR, human resource management functions can support employees. But if the HR or organizational members aren't paying attention to the risks associated with it, to the bias, aren't questioning the algorithms, right? They're purchasing, they're partnering with vendors, but are they asking the vendors, right, to really understand those algorithms and whether or not they are, in fact, auditing those algorithms, which of course is something I'm sure Alaina will be talking about as well. So I think it's a little bit of both.
Just one thing to add about your point. I mean, I think technology can complement humans. A lot of people are talking about, will it replace humans? Technology should never completely replace cognitive functioning of human beings. And the optimum function will be a partnership, but it requires humans to question, to understand where the data came from, to understand the strengths of any algorithm, to understand the limitations, and to always use their own judgment to understand whether or not they should use the outputs of that technology. I think that's really important.
Well, we will come back to that point, especially toward the end of the session when we are talking about how students should prepare to be partners with the technology. I would like to now focus on current applications of AI in different industries from our panelists, starting perhaps by Alaina, if you want to go
Yep.
first.
Sure, happy to. So, this is a race to disrupt before being disrupted, right? We are faced with all of the capabilities and how to use them. EY has already invested $1.4 billion in AI. This is both infusing AI to the point of not replacing humans and current technology, infusing it into existing technology, and thinking about the new solutions that can be developed. We're actually undertaking a plan to rationalize all of our technology solutions and investments so we can concentrate the investment in the space of AI because it has such a broad application, and it's going to eliminate the need for so many individual point solutions and really change the way we think about building technology, investing technology, and leveraging technology both to run our own business and to help our clients. From an EY perspective, it's really a three-pronged strategy. It's using AI to transform the way we deliver our current services, how we operate as a firm, how we help our clients to deploy AI within their different industries, and then really thinking about what are the new services we're going to be offering as a result of AI and its capabilities. I specialize in the tax area. I'm a CPA. I do tax technology and transformation. I've done a lot of work with Alteryx and Power Query and all these great tools that have really helped our tax functions transform over the last several years. We're finding there's a real limit to capacity and current technologies. So from a tax reform perspective, for those of you that are familiar with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, TCJA, you might be hearing a little bit about BEPS and Pillar 2 requirements. The amount of data and calculation burdens that have been put on the tax functions by different governments over the last 5 or so years have become so burdensome. And many of our companies did not have the data they needed to fulfill these requirements, do these calculations, to show what liability they owed, to prove they didn't owe a liability. So I'm working a lot with SAP, Oracle, and General Ledger systems, actually what we call tax sensitize the data, right? Really get the data at a granular level so our tax functions can do what they need to do. So great. SAP operates on a HANA database. In-memory computing will give you data down to a transactional level detail. Tax, here you go. This is everything you need. Well, what is a tax department supposed to do with transactional level data across 1,000 legal entities in 50 different countries? They can't handle it. So, as much as we have the data available now, and we have some, Alteryx, Power Query, machine learning type solutions out there, we are really feeling the rub of human capacity and existing technologies. So with the introduction of AI to augment current solutions or develop new solutions, it's fewer errors in more real time, and it's really going to take everything to that next level. I don't necessarily know where the solutions would be headed without that, because we're kind of in this time where, it's not so much we want it and need it. We just have to continue to be responsible about how we deploy it, and then really be smart about how we invest, where we invest, and how we tailor solutions. Again, not to be, okay, you have all this data, and now we have all these solutions, and how do you kind of bring those two together? So it is going to be a focused effort across tax, consulting, and audit as to, what's the most bang for our buck and what's the most practical from a client perspective.
Great, thank you. Jason, I'm very passionate about applications of AI in healthcare. Can you share with us how Northwell has incorporated the technology in operations and also patient care?
Yes, and by the way, it warms my heart to hear you talking about radiology. I also serve as the chairman of the Department of Radiology for the medical school here at Hofstra, so and we work together. So I'll give you a couple of examples of work that we're doing. So you could think of, healthcare is far broader than taking care of patients. We have 85,000 employees at Northwell. We run basically a small city. Every job you can imagine that is needed in any big corporation we have within Northwell. So I'll break this down into what I'll call back office functions, which would be similar across any industry, and then the patient-facing care delivery functions. The low-hanging fruit is in automating back office functions. So we've used for many years now robotic process automation to automate manual tasks, which are labor intensive and cognitively pretty easy and truthfully boring for people. And so an example of that is, say, revenue cycle. So the billing process in medicine is very complex, and computers are just very good at automating simple tasks that get done over and over and over again. It's very easy to set up processes so that we capture all the charges that humans may forget to manually put in. That's just a simple example. Other examples are creating very complex schedules. So not as complex as I imagine the Olympic schedule is. I heard that was one of the most, it takes years to create the Olympic schedule, but scheduling nurse assignments across a health system based on what their area of clinical expertise is, what their availability is, on and on, is incredibly complex and took humans who were overqualified and overpaid to be doing that kind of work. So this helps us bend the cost curve. It also helps us because it improves morale of the staff who would rather be doing higher functioning work than doing this boring automated work. And there's a shortage of healthcare workers. So those kinds of things are win-wins, low risk, high value, easy. On the care delivery side, it's a little more challenging. So we'll stick with radiology. So an example of some of the work, we've been doing a fair amount of research, and now we have FDA-approved tools, which we've helped develop, that can assist radiologists in making diagnoses. So life-threatening diagnoses, things like pulmonary embolism, which is a clot that can go to your lungs and kill you, or an aneurysm, a cerebral aneurysm in your brain, which is a small ballooning out of the artery, which can rupture and cause a subarachnoid hemorrhage and kill you. These are things that you never want to miss. Humans are fallible. We've shown that the combination of AI tools and humans outperforms either one alone. So those are examples where we're deploying AI technology right now in a low-risk environment, not replacing doctors, but augmenting their capabilities. And then, another example I would give is just on the research front. We have, one of the investigators I work with just got an NIH grant to develop an algorithm to detect early deterioration of patients. So how do we know before a patient drops their blood pressure that they have sepsis, right? So that you could treat them earlier. And so as Amir was saying before, we have huge amounts of data. So by importing data from all of our disparate systems and then analyzing them in real time without supervision, you can develop models that will predict which patients are in need of immediate assistance before they end up having a problem. So those are just some of the areas that we're developing. One last one I would say, because we haven't brought it up yet. These algorithms are only as good as the data sets that they're built upon. And one of the major risks is if they are built on too homogeneous of a population, that you can end up with healthcare disparities and inequitable distribution of healthcare resources. So we are cognizant of that and build very large data sets that represent the demographics of the United States down to within a couple of tenths of percentage points to make sure that the data is accurate, that we're building upon. But that is no small thing, because if you don't use the right data, the results that come out can have tragic results for patients.
Of course, and I've had experience of working with Northwell data, and in each project that we start, 80-90% of the project time is just spent on data curation, cleaning, and then we will get to the modeling, which is perhaps one of the skills that our students should focus on. I'm going to jump ahead. Quick question: do you foresee AI replacing radiologists? Because radiology is at the forefront of AI applications in
Yes.
medicine.
Yeah. So I don't remember whether it was Jeffrey Hinton. I think it was him who initially said that radiologists will be obsolete within 5 years, maybe 15 years ago. He predicted this. No, I don't see that. What I see is that, going back to the fact that we're drowning in data. So when I trained in radiology, the average CAT scan had 4 pages of film, because it wasn't digital. It was all on film back then. So, and each panel maybe had 16 images. So let's say you had 64 images to look at. Today, a CAT scan may have 1,000 images to look at, and we're reading hundreds of scans. Just the overwhelming amount of data to process is causing a stress and causing burnout for physicians. I think what's going to happen is you're going to automate relatively simple tasks so that the physicians can focus on the most complex cases that require far more than just identification of, oh, there's an aneurysm or there's a pulmonary nodule. And so simple tasks, I think, will be replaced. I'll get one example of one that I think can be replaced even today is mammography. So when you do screening mammography, you're basically looking for one disease. You're looking for breast cancer in a patient population that's normal, that don't think they have breast cancer, right? You're trying to catch it early. So in something as simple as, reading mammograms is not simple, but the task for a computer to say it's one diagnosis you're looking for on one imaging examination, we now have algorithms that are just as good as human beings. The question about whether or not in that case they'll replace radiologists is a legal one and a societal one. Because the question is, if a human's not involved and a computer makes a mistake, who gets sued? Who's liable, right? And is society willing to, if you think about automated cars, right? Why haven't they been adopted? Even if cars, autonomous vehicles, even if they crashed at a lower rate than humans, because we know humans are terrible at driving, right? We kill each other all the time. But we're intolerant of an autonomous vehicle ever making a mistake. And so if the barrier to replace humans in life-threatening situations is that they can never be wrong, then I don't see humans being replaced in those situations.
Great, thank you. Janet, what is your mind about the impact of AI on higher education, specifically what Zarb has done?
Well, that was a great tee up to brag about Zarb, so I'm going to take the opportunity to do that. And I'm preaching a little bit to the choir here because I know we're all part of the Zarb community. But, really, we as a faculty, I will say, we get together every year and do a retreat. And one of the topics on past year's retreat was really thinking about AI and how we can implement that into the student experience, right, into our curriculum, and making sure that our students, again, are getting really comfortable with that technology. We aren't looking to just make sure that all of you are skilled in one particular technology, right? Yeah, you're going to have to know Excel and you have to know certain things, right? But you also really have to have agility around technology. And that's what we're trying to do. And we're trying to use AI to help you develop skills that you need that are going to make you successful. So one example, of course, is our Core Skills Lab. And the Core Skills Lab was really developed with all of our students in mind in terms of creating an environment that will allow you to engage in self-directed learning and improve the skills that are so critically important to your success. And thanks to the president, we were able to get that lab funded. And the lab has all different types of platforms that uses AI to provide feedback. So for example, you're going on an interview. We're now beta testing, thanks to Patrick, a new technology that allows students to engage in a virtual interview. And the AI will give you feedback, very specific feedback around your behaviors, right? So what was your eye contact? Did you use a lot of fillers? What were the top 5 words that you used? Did you speak too fast? Were you too slow, right? What was your mannerisms? All those things matter because they will impact the decision maker, right, in terms of their perception of you. We can talk about whether or not that's a valid indicator of performance, but nonetheless, we know that happens, right? But equally as important, the AI will actually give you feedback around your answer. And so it will show you what you responded, and then the AI will give you a suggested script. So if it's a technical, right, some of the finance students in here, what is discounted cash flow, right? And so that's a typical question on investment banking interviews. And so the technology will ask you that, show you what you said, and then give you a suggested response. But here's what's critically important. And there's lots of examples, and I won't go into all of them. But again, going back to that human loop, right? So what it allows you to do in a very safe environment, you in a VR room, right? Getting feedback from an avatar, you're engaging with an avatar. It allows you to practice all of these skills, difficult conversations that you're going to have as future leaders. How do you handle a performance improvement plan session, right? How do you negotiate your salary? All those types of things are skills that you need to develop. How do you network? How do you walk into a room and start a conversation? You get the opportunity to practice that in a very safe environment, right? In virtual reality with an avatar, giving you that feedback. But what's critical is that that feedback can be shared and saved with your faculty, right? Because the human loop, to Jason's point, is so critically important, right? So that you can sit, because AI is wrong sometimes. And so maybe some of the feedback it gave you, there might not be the best feedback. And so you want to also sit with your faculty member and say, is this true? Would this be a better answer, right? And so the lab is really about infiltrating it into our curriculum and into our students' experience, both as a self-directed learning tool as well as something to work with and partner with your faculty.
Thank you. And I encourage all the students to go to the center. Catherine Fisher, our wonderful colleague, has done a wonderful job in coordinating the lab. Get in touch and make yourself familiar with the technology.
That's the end of the commercial.
Good.
Michael, I want to talk to you about an area, the AI explainability, transparency, governance. You're an expert in this field. My probably first encounter with bias in machine learning was Google Translate. My native language is Persian, and pronouns in Persian are gender neutral. And maybe 5 years ago, when we would ask Google to translate from Farsi, he or she is a nurse, Google Translate would say she's a nurse. But when we do that with doctor, it would say he's a doctor. And that was one of the early examples. Can you elaborate on this and how we should address this?
Sure, it's a really important topic. So before I get into those 4 buzzwords, let me just add to what Amir said at the beginning of how machine learning works. Right. So what it's basically doing is looking at a large amount of data and trying to find patterns. That's basically it. Right. And so to illustrate this, imagine you're a new employee. You were hired, let's say, as a bank officer. You're approving loans, and the person training you is going to have tried 2 different ways of training you. One way to train you is to say, let's go over the history of the loans that we received from applicants over the past, let's say, year, and I'll tell you which ones we approved and which ones we denied. And you can look at the application and you can see all the answers that the applicant wrote down. And if you're capable, you could say, okay, I'm seeing a pattern here. It seems like those with higher salaries or less debt are the ones we tend to approve. And you might sort of postulate that, that's maybe the inherent rule here, the inherent pattern, so that when a new applicant comes, you can apply whatever model you created in your head to say, okay, I think this is on this side of the line or that side of the line. That's how machine learning works, looking for patterns. Amir also talked about rule-based systems, and he gave a nice example where it would be, no, I'll tell you the rules. So in my case where you're training this new employee, you would actually say, okay, our policy says the salary must be greater than this, and the debt must be lower than that, and so on. So they explicitly tell you the rules, which would be very easy if they're written down to sort of follow and say, okay, when I get a new one, what happens? And the reason I mention this is how everything you're using works, right? It's all about sort of probabilities and patterns, right? So when you're typing on your phone and you're saying, I want to go to and it suggests some words, it's basically looking at it's already looked at a big corpus of similar sentences and predicting what's likely to come next, right? And it's magical sometimes, the way it works really well. But if you have something that's not common, then of course it's not going to suggest that. So that's how it works. Now get back to those 4 buzzwords. The first one that was mentioned is fairness or bias, right? And the question is, well, what can happen? And there's many, many examples on the internet. One Amir just mentioned. Another very famous example was a company decided, one of the really hard tasks we have is hiring new employees. We have one job opening, and we may get 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 applicants. And it's really labor intensive to go through all those resumes to figure out which 5 we're going to interview for this one job opening. Couldn't we train an AI system to do some weeding of that? So rather than look at 10,000 resumes, it maybe suggest the top 100, and then we'll have a human go and look at those 100 to pick the magic 5, right? So such a system was proposed. And the first question that comes up is, well, how are we going to teach that system? What's the data we're going to give it? What are the previous resumes that we're going to give it to be able to learn the pattern? And what this particular company did is they said, well, we'll take all the ones that have been applied to us in the last few years, the ones we interviewed and the ones we didn't interview, and it will learn from that. So it's basically learning what we've done in the past to do what we want to do in the future. The problem they very quickly learned is that resumes that had some indication that the person was female got scored lower in their pattern recognition model, right? So they didn't explicitly say, we don't want to hire females or we're less likely, or anything like that. It was in their data set of these are the ones we interviewed, these are the ones we didn't interview. There seemed to be this pattern. And this was typically something like if there was a mention I was on the women's soccer team or some indication that the person was a woman. So they quickly said, okay, this is really bad, and let's not do that. So they canceled the project. So that's how bias comes up. And it was mentioned earlier, it's all about the training data set. What are you learning about, right? There's other examples where there'll be like a facial recognition. You've probably heard about this, very important piece of technology and controversial. Quite often it's trained on images that happen to be white males, right? And they'll maybe proclaim that when we test it, it's 99% accurate. But if you test it on a more diverse population, it's actually not, right? So it's incredibly important to know what was the training data set for this, and is it applicable to how I'm going to use the technology. If I'm going to only recognize white males, then maybe it's fine. But if I'm doing the general population, it's a very bad idea, right? So that's what the topic of bias comes up. Quite often it comes from the training data. It's really, really important, and it comes up many different ways. The second topic is explainability, right? And what does that mean? Well, that means that if I got denied my loan in that hypothetical situation, why was I denied? Right? And if you think about it, the way this is working, it's looking at, let's say, a year's worth of previous loan applicants, and it's learning a pattern. And internally, this is like a mathematical formula with lots of coefficients that even the data scientist who builds it doesn't understand, right? So that's, on one hand, powerful, on the other hand, not so great, because when you come and apply and I say, sorry, you can't get the loan, and you say, why not? I've got nothing for you. I've got this formula that I don't even understand, right? So a major problem with the technology today is the inability to explain how the decisions are made, right? And it's a very, very active area for research. Just a caveat on that is there are many important decisions that are made in human life where we don't give explanations, right? So clearly, I think you probably, hopefully, are all unsettled and saying, wow, this AI stuff sounds powerful, but it can't even explain why it made an important decision. That's really scary. We should have regulations and so on, which is quite reasonable. But just an observation, there are other things that happen that we don't have explanations for. So for example, there was recently, I think it was a podcast where they were talking about Ozempic, the new wonder drug. And no one knows why it works, but it works. People love it. In fact, there's a shortage to be able to, it's for weight loss. It's a shortage for people to get it. Another example is when you are on trial and you're found guilty, you don't get an explanation. This is, to me, is mind-boggling because your life is dramatically impacted and you don't really get an explanation. It's just the jury of your peers and so on. There are many examples of that. So there's a lot of philosophical questions to be asked here. I'm definitely not a philosopher. I'm just throwing it out there. So that's number 2. Number 3 is transparency. What's that? Transparency, general term, it basically says, can you tell me something about how things work? And it sounds like explainability, but it's not. The best way to think of it is packaged foods, right? So 20, 30, 40 years ago, people were concerned that you could throw any kind of label on packaged food as natural or healthy or things like that. And what's really in there? And I want to know things like, well, what's the sodium level? What are the calories and stuff like that? So there was actually a 20-year process the U.S. government went through to have the nutritional label that we all know about, right? And so the question is, can you have a nutritional label for AI that tells you the information you want to know, such as going back to the training data set? What was it trained on? What were the demographics there? So I can know if it's useful to use in a particular situation. And then finally, the fourth buzzword is governance, which is not a new term. It's applied to many, many, many things. And that's basically saying, is there someone in the company or in the country that's controlling things, that's governing the AI, that's making sure it's being used in a responsible way, making sure things are being measured, all these risks we mentioned are being measured, and then having some kind of mitigation or definitely a human AI partnership to make sure that we're mitigating the risks as much as possible.
I just want to add one thing about data, picking up on what you said. You know, it's not just making sure that the data that's used is the data that you want and is appropriate, but there's a concept of data drift, which is just because something worked at time zero with amount of data that you put in doesn't mean that it's going to work forever. The world changes. You know, an example of that is there was at another institution, there was an algorithm that was used to detect early deterioration of patients with sepsis, and it was built during COVID. Well, everything was different during COVID. And the patients in the hospitals where the data set which was trained on were very different from a routine patient population under ordinary circumstances. So it worked brilliantly for a period of time, but no one was following it. They just assumed, well, it worked, so it's going to continue to work. So for any of these, you really need to monitor. So it turns out that all these patients that were being alerted to having sepsis didn't have sepsis over a period of time, and they had to stop using it. So my only point is not to be lulled into a sense of complacency just because something comes out of the box that you might buy commercially and you plug it in and it works, and you say, oh, great, it works, and just set it and forget it. None of this can be done that way. It must be continually monitored, and that requires a whole operational mindset shift.
Great, thank you. So for the audience, we are 10 minutes away from Q&A. Get your questions ready. I'm gonna ask for your advice for our students. Very quick, 2 to 3 minutes. We have a diverse, I would assume, students from different schools here. What do you recommend?
I'm happy to start because I'm excited to look out into this group and just, be thankful for the symposium that, Hofstra is hosting this week as an employer, as someone looking to that next generation of who we're bringing in. The skill sets are shifting. They need to be shifting. And I really just think, form your own point of view. Think about how you are going to use AI in a way to be the best, whatever it is you want to be, because we're really going to be looking for folks that have started to think about that have a core skill set where they can really use AI and apply it. I think be conscious of the race to who's getting there first. When I think about what if we build out these capabilities in our audit practice, but our clients haven't built out those capabilities yet to prepare the provision we're auditing. Well, that's really not a fair fight. So really just, track the literature, be thankful and participate as much as you can in what Hofstra is bringing to you at a very, very early stage, and really just stay in touch with and form your own point of view on how this is going to make you really successful in the next few years.
Quick question. Do you suggest accounting majors take programming courses?
Accounting and tax is all about the data. So yes, there absolutely is a technology element, which I spent 17 years in industry as a VP of international tax. I loved it, but I saw the train coming, and it was all about data and calculations and building efficiencies and minimizing errors. So there's really no accounting or technology, tax or technology. It's really the foundation, but you do need that core technical skill set to be able to apply it together.
Great, thank you.
My advice is to first realize you're in a great position right now. The opportunities that exist are tremendous, particularly if you're open to bridging communities. And in particular, I'll mention three. One is what I've been trained in is sort of core computer science, technology, and so on, the so-called geeks of the world, right? Right now, they're the ones that are creating these new algorithms and having amazing capabilities and so on, but they're not trained to think about the issues that we've been talking about, the philosophical issues, the risk issues, and so on. And those are incredibly important, as we've been saying. Then there's the people who can think about, I would say, more liberal arts background, the people who can think about philosophy, think about society, think about what's right, what's wrong, regardless of the technology, and the technology should comply with whatever we think is right for society. That's not my background, but that's incredibly important. Without that, the technologists will run off and do stuff unless we have sort of the watchdog saying, okay, let's make sure and think about the bigger picture. And then the third area, we didn't touch on much here, but it's a big topic, is I would say the lawyers and the regulators part. You probably are aware there's a tremendous amount of discussion going on. I think there's going to be an announcement, I think today or tomorrow, the federal government regarding regulating AI in some way. The EU has already done this. New York City has already done this in certain situations. And so this is going to happen. And the challenge is the regulators know about public policy. They know about what's hopefully good for society. They don't know much about the technology, right? Which could be good, but also could be dangerous. The ethicists or liberal arts majors certainly can know about society and what's good, and then maybe they're not experts on how to write laws or regulations, but they should all be part of the conversation. So clearly, you could pick one of those and go really deep in those areas. But if you can bridge between those two, it's an amazing opportunity, because there's very, very few people who want to cross those boundaries. It's kind of like the translator in some sense, where you can actually be fluent in those areas and sort of make connections that right now we don't have people making. So the reason why this is a huge opportunity is it's all new. So it's not like studying calculus, where it was invented 400 years ago, and okay, I'm the next person to teach, to learn, whatever it is, the 17th edition of the calculus textbook, right? This is all new. It's all being made up. There's not textbooks on this just yet. And so there's tremendous opportunity. And as Alaina said, I think finding a niche where you're interested and following your passion is incredibly important.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with both of my colleagues. I think if I were to add to it, I would just say, study what you're passionate about. Be an expert in whatever it is you're passionate about. Love the idea of being interdisciplinary. Everyone has a role to play in this. In terms of skills that will be transferable, really understanding how to interact with large, complex data sets is important no matter what you're going to do going forward. I don't think you necessarily need to be computer scientists. Most of where this is going is to low code or no code. I think you're going to see a future where it's going to be as simple to use as, like when I was growing up, I learned computer programming. It was, home computers were all new, right? And you think about anybody can use a computer today. These things are going to be made to be, mind-numbingly simple to operate, but very complex to actually know what to do with. And so I think just building your analytical skills and your data, your comfort with handling data, knowing how to analyze it, knowing how to make decisions, these things, no matter what domain you study, will be relevant. And I can't agree anymore. I mean, totally emphasize, the most important thing I think we need people with a conscience. We need people who their heart's in the right place and they're going to follow their moral compass, because the danger of this technology is real. And I just think whether it turns out to be a friend or foe will be entirely dependent on how we use it.
Just wanted to add one thing. There's been a lot, right? You hear some of the headlines, like Goldman came out with a report and said, 300 million jobs are going to be lost because of AI. But what didn't capture the headline was the next part of that report that said, yeah, but if you look back historically with every major automation, what happened is a new emerging occupations were identified and created. And so there's lots of opportunities here. And so the advice that you just got from all of these amazing panelists, take it to heart, right? The time that you're here on our amazing campus gives you unbelievable opportunities to get comfortable, right, in using this technology and get comfortable in questioning that technology and developing that critical thinking and innovator's mindset in terms of how can you use that data in a way that's for good. Because Jason's 100% right. Friend or foe is really going to depend upon the human actors.
Great, thank you. With that, we will open up to audience Q&A. If you have a question, please raise your hand, and you're going to have to walk to the microphone, please. We need questions. Go ahead, please.
You didn't generate it using ChatGPT, right?
All right, so this is mostly a healthcare-oriented question, so maybe I'd like to extend it to Mr. Naidich. So you mentioned the case of the lawyer who used ChatGPT and came up with some, it came up with its own case law. You also mentioned that you wouldn't consider AI to be a set-it-and-forget-it type of tool. Tools is only as useful as its user. Do you have concerns that perhaps maybe patients or other, assistants in the healthcare environment may try to use ChatGPT the way people use WebMD to, make a unofficial diagnosis and then come up with this notion in their head that this is what it may be? And how might that affect patient-provider experiences?
That's such a great question. We're already seeing it. People are using it. People have it on their phone. And it's the next iteration of what people were doing just with Google, where they were just looking up. And for a long time now, this is the downside of the democratization of information. You have to spend a lot of time with people sometimes, disabusing them of the false information that they've ingested online. That being said, I'm a huge advocate for the democratization of knowledge. It used to be that only the privileged few who spent their lives on campuses like this had access to the most valuable information. There are downsides to people knowing. I think the real key is, and this goes back to government regulation, and how do we help people understand what is true, whether it's in healthcare or whether it's other bad state actors who are going to try and, it's not just the generation of data or prose, but people can generate images, lifelike images, videos that are virtually indistinguishable. So how are any of us going to know what's true going forward? And with the breakdown, I'm sorry, I'm on my soapbox for a second, but with the breakdown in trust in society, where we don't trust our government anymore, where we don't trust experts anymore, I think this is a potential danger. I don't have an answer for how we get that, but I think it's a really important question for how we help people understand what is true.
Thank you.
I'll just add, earlier when we mentioned the lawyer situation, and I said, the lawyer felt, I'll ask ChatGPT, did you generate this? I mean, is this actually true? And ChatGPT said yes, and the lawyer felt good, right? What I just want to mention there is that the reason why it's not a good question is because ChatGPT has no concept, in this version of the system, of anything it's done before. You can imagine all the people using it. It's not recording every answer it's given before. And it also doesn't know what is true or not. It's doing this autocomplete exercise. So when you say, did you generate this? It recognizes, okay, this is a yes or no question. Yes, right? That's what's going on there, right? So it sounds like a silly example, but I think it gets to Jason's point as well, or one part of it, it's a much bigger space, is that if we can understand what these things are good at and what they're not good at, then we can hopefully diminish a little bit the misinformation and misuse characteristics there.
Maybe just one other thing, because you guys mentioned Google. In the world of tax, with all the different rules, regulations, changes, it is very easy to use something like Google to help cue you down a path, right? I'm not doing technical work anymore. And I'm not suggesting that we should Google a tax concept and write a memo for our client, which they then use as a public company. But it does help us sometimes cut through how do we get to the right expert within our organization based on, the concept, figuring out what section of the code it was, understanding what part and where the nuance is to get to the right resource quickly to bring to our client to maybe have that right conversation. So it's leveraging the capabilities in a way where it would take me a really long time to start reading the section of the code I thought it maybe was, not finding it and going to the next book to really point me in a direction to then take the right steps and make sure we're following the right protocols. So there's definitely that balance, but it accelerates our ability to get those solutions to clients quickly.
Any other questions from the audience?
I'll ask a question.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jacqueline Burke. I'm the chair of the accounting department. So I'll direct this to Alaina, although it applies to everyone. What do you do in the company, what are you doing to assure that employees are remaining skeptical of this information and constantly questioning the data they get from ChatGPT or other sources of artificial intelligence? Because that seems to be, it's a mindset. It's not just something you can tell the employees to do and they'll do it.
It is, we're almost more focused on the upskilling and reimagining how we're training our people overall. I think the discipline around using it, it's coming very quickly. But, our ethical standards apply to everything we do, right? Whether it be how we handle client data, how we conduct ourselves in a public environment. And that's going to apply here as well. I think it's, again, putting that governance structure and framework around what we're using AI for and how we're using it and standardizing that across our practices. But I think at this point, we're almost more focused on making sure folks understand how it can be used, how it should be used, and then obviously that governance will come with it. I know we talked a little bit about, AI putting people out of work and new jobs being created. We're also finding a workforce shortage, right, for some of the activities and tasks, and folks just, new generations not wanting to do things the way they were done before because they know they can be done better. So I do think, again, we're filling a gap that's naturally starting to occur. So that's also something where I think, I'm less worried about this putting people out of work than creating new opportunities and filling a gap where there just are natural gaps already.
So that you may have discerned, there's sort of two kinds of AI systems. Well, there's many kinds of AI systems, but the ones we're focusing on now. One is what's now being called traditional machine learning. It was on Amir's chart. It was the supervised one that was on, I think, that side. And then there's the generative AI or ChatGPT style or foundational model style, and that was sort of on the bottom one. My interactions with a lot of companies, a lot of folks are using traditional machine learning. And the way that works is you have a particular task in mind, such as all the ones I mentioned before, like loan applications or student applications or whatever it may be. You say, make a prediction, is this a good candidate or not candidate, right? So that's pretty popular, I would say, with companies right now. The other kind, the generative AI, the ChatGPT kind, the kind you've probably used, there's been lots and lots of concerns and risks, as we've talked about. But one you may not have known of is there was an employee, happened to be Samsung, who was a programmer. And they had a bunch of code, and I think that wasn't working correctly. So they uploaded the company's code to ChatGPT and basically said, can you help me find the bug? And it turns out that these models are actually pretty good at this kind of task. That's a whole other story in itself. But anyway, in this particular case, the person uploaded the code, and it turned out to be the company's code. It was proprietary code. It was a trade secret. So this was a big deal because it's up into the ChatGPT, and that could be used to help generate someone else's code who gets asked from maybe a different company and so on. So because of that, Samsung said to all the employees, thou shalt not use ChatGPT or something else. And it wasn't the only one. There was a bunch of other large companies in Korea and lots of companies in financial system and financial space, IBM as well, all told their employees, at least for now, no good. Don't use this for lots of reasons, right? So that's the back to your question about what do you do in terms of the culture and so on. So right now there's this real brute force saying no. That's clearly going to change over time, where we have to get the right kind of governance and guardrails and figure out what makes sense and what doesn't make sense. And a big concern, I think it was mentioned earlier, is sort of the whole IP aspect of there's a lot of pending lawsuits right now where artists and writers have content that was scraped from the internet and then fed into these models. They need large data sets. And now the question, when it generates a new novel based on someone else's work, is that fair use or not, right? And so companies are really skittish because they could get sued if they did something that's wrong. So a lot of companies are saying, all right, I like this idea, but I don't like the fact it came from random data that I don't know its provenance. So can you build me a version for myself and so on? So it's over time, it's exciting. A lot of things will happen. Right now, the door is for many companies is closed, but it'll probably open in more selective ways. And training will be, and training will be, of course, incredibly important. Culture, you'll see one of the things most large companies do, or probably most companies do, is when you're an employee, once a year you have to read the guidelines for employment and then certify you read them. And some of them say you could be fired if you do X, Y, and Z. And I'm sure there will be those kinds of things included there.
I just wanted to add, Mike, because I completely agree with much of what you just said. But leadership matters, right? And so just like if you as a leader are only measuring success based on shareholder wealth, right, and building shareholder wealth, you're driving behaviors that might have unintended consequences, right, in terms of long-term growth of your company. And the same thing here. If you're only focused on improving efficiency in your selection process, well, you might increase your metric around time to hire, but leave a lot of great people that could have added to the value of your company on the cutting room floor because you forfeited quality, right? And so leadership matters. You have to critically think, and you have to think about how you're going to use this technology and the outputs of that technology to drive decisions, right, for long-term growth of your company when we think about leadership.
I'm Professor Nick Pratt from Finance Department. The question goes to Michael. No matter how careful we are, innovators are extremely careful, we cannot make the risk of technology risk, legal risk is zero. So at the end of the day, insurance companies will step in to issue some policies for the benefit of my finance students. And Michael, at IBM, are they working on any software to price risk? For example, if somebody wants to buy some insurance for that 1%, 0.5%, risk, are they working on that?
Yeah, in fact, I co-wrote a short article talking about, you'll see the emergence of this coming soon, just a few years ago. So the big insurance companies have been for a while now looking at sort of security, cybersecurity, and the ambitious ones were getting in that space to say, hey, I can insure. If you're in a company and you're concerned about being attacked in some way, I can give you a policy there to deal with those kinds of risks, right? So that's one thing. I mention that because that's an example that didn't exist maybe 10, 15 years ago, but large insurance companies are getting in that space, and you now can get those policies. So the same thing is starting to happen with AI, with very large insurance companies. And the question, in fact, I was involved with some discussions with very large insurance companies where exactly your point is like, hey, I'm working on some stuff that could kind of quantify risk of AI. Could that be useful for pricing for you? I can tell you if it's high, low, medium, and so on. And I was a little disappointed what I learned at how the insurance industry works. And this was just, a 30-minute meeting there where it was, the impression I got would be sort of like my fictitious view of how my home insurance works or my car insurance works, where someone really looks at my personal situation or my home and then creates a rate appropriate for that because I'm in a flood zone or whatever it may be. It turned out in this space, it wasn't as precise because there's a trade-off between, in order to do that precise analysis requires time, and is it really, it's a cost, and is it really worth it or not? So anyway, the answer to your question is I think it's a very exciting space. I just read about a company this morning, ironically, that's doing that it's a technology company that's doing the measurement part, partnering with a large insurance company that's going to underwrite this. So I think absolutely it's going to be there. The question is, what's the price going to be, and who's going to lose their shirt for not pricing it high enough?
I was just going to say that people are going to lose their shirts. People don't know how the technology works. So anyone who tells you that they can estimate the risk of AI at this stage is making it up. And I'm sure some of them will make money off of it, and some of them will, I'm not in the business of advising insurance companies, but I would advise any large insurance company to stay as far away as they can from this until they figure out a little more about it, because there's no way to understand the risk.
And just to add to that, the large insurance company that I was talking to is the, I think, second largest reinsurance company. And they decided to get in, to dip their toes in, but they did a spin-off because they didn't want the big company to, if it goes under or gets sued or anything.
That's an interesting point, because we are worried about the conflict between the audit side of our practice, the tax side of our practice, and the consulting side of our practice. And will AI and our solutions and offerings be such that, those three things really can't live in the same home anymore? So that's something that, we're trying to just be really tactical about and think through as just an organization as we move forward. Are we going to be basically, implicating ourselves based on solutions we're building maybe on our consulting side, and what we need to maintain from an independence and audit perspective. So that's something we're always trying to balance as well.
Just to add one more example, one of the things IBM is now doing is, before I mentioned scraping the internet and the data, and there's a risks that you may have included data that in your model that you shouldn't have, and then therefore if I'm a company that buys the model, now I can be sued because for copyright infringement. One of the things IBM, and you'll see other companies probably doing this, has done is they're basically saying, I'm going to create my own data set that I know I've trained and I can vouch for, and then they're taking on liability for just that particular risk. Since I know I own this data, then I will have liability. If you get sued for some kind of copyright infringement for that, then we'll take that on. So it's not insurance in a general risk, because, as Jason said, that's much, much bigger, but very specific. And maybe you'll see more of that sort of happening. Doesn't solve all the concerns the customer has, but it may start to address them.
Thank you. Thank you all. Any other questions? Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Matt Mandelis. I'm an accounting major and junior at Zarb. First and foremost, thank you for speaking with us today. My question is geared more towards Alaina. Hearing all the information that we have now about AI helping tax become a more strategic business function overall, can you elaborate on the opportunities that new CPAs and accountants coming into this space could have to help build value for clients, drive decision-making, and reducing risk?
Absolutely. So I really think you need to think of AI, one, as something that it's unavoidable. So it's interesting because the CPA Journal had it on the front cover. I got invited to this symposium, and every EY call I've had this week has had a component of an AI strategy. So this is here to stay. It's here to stay for accountants. It's here to stay for healthcare. It's here to stay for everyone. I think you really need to think of this as a tool in your toolbox and think about how you're going to use it and apply it, and really stay current with how firms are using it and apply it. It really comes down to the massive data sets, the amount of analytics, the amount of risk inherent in a public company misstating their financial statements. So depending on where you take your accounting degree, whether it be more controller function in corporate accounting, an audit function, a tax function, it's really just meant to be a tool for you to be able to do the best job you can in any of those areas. We've been using machine learning as we go, something as simple as mapping trial balances. We like to standardize the way we deliver our compliance services. So we have a standard chart of accounts within our process. So every new client has their own chart of account, and we have to map it to our standard chart. Initially, this was being done manually. Then eventually we were able to train a model to start making better associations where an Alteryx, a Power Query, Excel functions, you'd have to tell it, if it's this account number with this name, it goes here, XYZ. Then with being able to train the model, we were able to, with additional data sets having been already mapped to that standard chart of account, the more and more we're able to quickly load a chart, it automatically gets mapped, somebody reviews whatever exceptions there are, and we move on. So it's really depending on what you choose to specialize in, how are you going to be able to use AI just to augment, your ability to do things better, faster, and use your time, to do more value-added tasks.
All right. Thank you, Alaina. With that, we will end the panel. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. Thank you for the audience.